Welcome to Everything Interview with a Vampire Part 1. This is going to be a 4-part series. We're going to cover each one of the parts of Interview with a Vampire separately, and this is because covering both what happened, all of the relevant quotes, and diving into the different thematic elements that Interview with a Vampire and further installments of the Vampire Chronicles are rife with has taken me a long time to do, and I think it's going to end up being a very long-winded video. I am tentatively planning to stitch all 4 parts together into one long video when this series is complete, but for now, let's just get into it. Do an author's intentions matter? Anne Rice wrote Interview with a Vampire during one of the worst times in her life, right after she was getting over her young daughter's death of cancer. While Anne Rice claims it was entirely unintended, Interview with a Vampire is steeped in ennui and questions of life, death, and human mortality. It's worth mentioning right here at the top that I don't dive into all of the elements of loss and death that this book covers, even though it's probably the main thematic draw of Interview, because there are so many little details and bits you could pick apart about different relationships throughout the book. I'd literally be rereading and quoting the entire thing to you. Later books in the Chronicle of the Vampire series do move past the state of loss and grief, both thematically and tonally. The Vampire Chronicles in general have a huge following of readers and fans, and we all bring something a little bit different and special to this literary work. You can see this in a lot of discussions about the themes and intricacies that you find both in Interview with a Vampire and further Vampire Chronicle novels. The historical span of time covered in the Vampire Chronicles as a whole is so large that it gives us a little bit of insight into racial, gender, age, and ability interpretations throughout history. And it also gives us a chance to sort of like meta talk a little bit about whether or not this is an 80s take or a historical take or some kind of in between. And each reader is going to bring their own personal insight and experience. Some things we can ask on our journey: are these undercurrents intentional? Does intentionality matter in regard to how audiences choose to read this text or other installments? When are we getting a more modern perspective versus a more historical perspective? What do we think of that perspective now as readers versus maybe what readers thought of it when it was released? Anne Rice made the conscientious decision to tell Lewis's story through an interview narrative. Lewis is telling us the story as he remembers it or how he wants it to be remembered or thought of now. So we should be on the lookout for different perceptions that might not have been there at the time, or different wording or phrasing that might be coloring something now as he's sharing it that wouldn't have been there originally. And we should also pay special note to when the interviewer, David, actually interrupts Lewis and asks him questions. Part of the reason we have to evaluate whether or not Lewis is being truthful or whether or not Lewis's memory is accurate. This one-off book did become an entire series, and the later installments are mostly told from Lestat and other vampires' perspectives. And we need to start asking ourselves what really happened. Let's roll right into part 1. Interview with a Vampire is set in New Orleans in the 1980s. And we're meeting David. He's referred to as the boy, although it's worth noting Lewis seems to call anyone under 50 a boy. He's recording this vampire story on tape for us. At first, David seems a little bit skeptical of whether or not Lewis is a vampire or not, and that lasts for all of 10 paragraphs. The vampire was utterly white and smooth, as if he were sculpted from bleached bone, and his face was seemingly as inanimate as a statue, except for 2 brilliant green eyes that looked down at the boy intently, like flames in a skull. Page 4, Interview with a Vampire. Since David met Lewis at a bar, there has always been some level of fan speculation that this was a gay bar and that David is gay or bisexual. This adds an interesting element to David and Lewis's interactions going forward. Further colors the narrative that Lewis shares with us when we think about his relationship between himself and Lestat and later himself and Armand. Meet Lewis. He's very serious and dour. he consistently insists that he will not hurt David. And it's very unclear if we should believe him or not, because a lot of times he says it completely unprompted by David or any actions David's taking. Lewis insists that he is detached from humanity, but he seems to enjoy messing with David and getting a rise out of him. Ah, that's the accent, the boy said softly. For a moment, the vampire stared blankly. I have an accent? He began to laugh, and the boy, flustered, answered quickly. I noticed it in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness of consonants, that's all. I never guessed it was French. It's all right, the vampire assured him. I'm not as shocked as I pretend to be. It's only that I forget it from time to time. But let me go on. Page 5. Interview with the vampire. Lewis starts us off at the very beginning of his tale when he's human. He's 25 years old in 1791, living with his family in a plantation called Point de Lac. His father's deceased. Lewis is in charge of the plantation. He has his mother, his younger sister, and a younger brother in tow that he cares for. Mother and sister are quite easy to take care of. They like to go out and party and socialize. Religious brother seems to take a little bit more work. He helps protect the brother from the mother and sister's desire for him to join them in these parties. He builds the brother an oratory so he can sit and pray. While this brother is never named, he is incredibly important to Lewis, and he doesn't take the warning signs of something going potentially amiss with his brother very seriously, although the slaves and his sister and his mother all think his brother is going insane because he stops taking care of himself or his surroundings and simply sits in his oratory staring at the cross. And Lewis is convinced that this isn't madness, this is just a sign of his brother's devotion. One more certainty that eventually his brother is going to go and follow his dreams as a priest. Until one night, Lewis's brother comes to him and tells him he's had a vision from God. He is a saint. He needs to go back to France to preach the good word and convert the heathens. To do this successfully, Lewis needs to sell the plantation and give all of his money to his brother. Naturally, Lewis laughs at his brother. The two of them have a huge argument. The brother storms out. He falls on the stairs and dies. Lewis is immediately heartbroken and grief-stricken. He refuses to talk to his sister or mother about what actually happened. There's some suspicion that Lewis might have actually pushed him, although Lewis denies this vehemently to David. This is where we begin to see Lewis as a philosophical monster. Even now, hundreds of years later, he's still hung up on the death of his brother. He doesn't know whether or not his brother really had a vision or not, whether or not as a good Catholic man he should have believed in his brother and it was some kind of ego that held him back from believing him. Not only did I not believe he saw visions, I couldn't entertain the notion for a moment, because he was my brother. Holy he might be. Particular, most definitely. But Francis of Assisi? No, not my brother. No brother of mine could be such. That is egotism. Do you see? Page 8 to 9 on Interview with a Vampire. This element is fairly open-ended, so some things we as readers have to ask ourselves. Did Lewis's brother really have a vision? Did Lewis's brother make this story up as a way to get the family money? Was Lewis's brother mentally ill and in need of some kind of help? Is Lewis responsible for his brother's death? Lewis and his family move out of Point de Lac and into town. Here, Lewis is getting drunk and starting bar fights and basically courting death. During one of these altercations, he gets so ill that a priest is called, and for the first time, Lewis opens up about his brother's death and confesses everything to this priest because he fears he might truly die. The priest, however, laughs and scorns Lewis as a weak man. He says he is choosing to die alongside his brother instead of living for his sister and mother. And he claims the vision that Lewis's brothers had weren't heavenly ones, but devilish ones. Lewis uses this little side point to discuss religion and religious men in a fairly derogatory manner. People who cease to believe in God or goodness altogether still believe in the devil. Evil is always possible, and goodness eternally difficult. But to stand in the presence of a saint, to believe a saint has sent a vision? No, it's egotism, our refusal to believe it could occur in our midst. Page 13, Interview with a Vampire. And this is when Lewis finally meets Lestat and begins his vampire journey. Lestat's a fairly young vampire. We know this because he's traveling with his mortal father. He seems to choose Lewis for a lot of reasons, but primarily because he's wealthy. Even at this first meeting, it does seem like there's a lot of sexual tension between the two of them. The overall description of Lestat is highly reminiscent of how a crush might describe their focus of love. And as soon as Lewis becomes a vampire, he begins hating, resenting, and finding fault with Lestat. A lot of times, some of these complaints against Lestat come off as Lewis having a superiority complex or being disparaging to Lestat's stature in life. Lewis doesn't seem to be trying to understand where Lestat is coming from any more than Lestat is trying to understand where Lewis is coming from. As far as Lewis's actual turning, he describes it a lot like a frat boy hazing ritual. First, he witnesses the murder of his plantation slave overseer. He forces Lewis to dispose of the corpse in the woods. Lewis is sort of scarred by this interaction, and he's sort of having second thoughts about the whole vampire thing. He tells Lestat to call the whole thing off, but it's way too late for that, and Lestat basically laughs at him, grabs him, and drains him to the point of near death, where he then cuts his own wrist, brings it to Lewis's mouth, and has Lewis drink his blood. The vampire's senses taken, he's overwhelmed, born new, and in love with the world again. That evening, there's some gross disposal of human fluids that go on for Lewis, and Lestat says he's not quite a vampire yet, but the next evening he'll be born again, a vampire in truth. We're left asking ourselves, what's the difference between the human and the vampire Lewis? Lewis insists to David that the vampire transformation is as much mental as it was physical. He acts as if this death removed all forms of humanity from him, and he uses his obsession with the loss of his brother as proof. I passed my brother's oratory without so much as a thought of him. But this proof, to me, overlooks a couple essential things. Lewis seems truly tormented and tortured over the loss of his brother all these years later, and never really adequately addresses Lewis's choice to reside in the oratory after he's transformed. Becoming a vampire at best seems to be a distraction, especially because we know humans do get over loss and handle grief in different ways. If you're in a survival situation, you might handle the loss of a loved one as just something you shrug off and continue to move with because you have to survive. Lewis has his first kill coming up, and this is the beginning of his endless list of gripes. Lewis describes drinking blood as overwhelming all of his senses. And if he were Lestat training the new vampire, he'd have started that vampire off with animals and worked them up to humans. Lestat starts Lewis off feeding on humans and generally laughs at him for his reaction. He sort of derogatorily mentions in an offhand kind of way, you have to stop drinking before the person dies, or else that person's blood will drag you to true death. And he feeds on animals exclusively for the next 4 years. Meanwhile, Lestat loves being a vampire. He kills multiple people a night. He'll kill slaves, he'll kill nobles. He's 100% indiscriminate. Although Lewis does notice a pattern in how Lestat kills, and he claims that Lestat not noticing this own pattern is just one more way he's entirely unself-aware. A fresh young girl, that was his favorite for the first of the evening. But the triumphant kill for Lestat was a younger man. A young man around your age would have appealed to him in particular. They represented the greatest loss to Lestat because they stood on the threshold of maximum possibility of life. Of course, Lestat didn't understand himself. I came to understand it. Lestat understood nothing. On page 41 of Interview with a Vampire. And some other things we can look at this early juncture is, what does killing mean to Lewis? Why is killing animals so much simpler than humans? Why does Lewis assume that killing means something different for Lestat than it does him? And can we, the readers, learn anything about Lewis or Lestat based off of their killings? For the next 4 years, Lewis and Lestat live at Point de Lac with Lestat's elderly father. Lestat's generally gauche and bloodthirsty and extra, while Lewis seems to be sort of grumpy happy and trying to cope, Lestat ends up fixating on this one young man who's a plantation owner nearby, Fernia, really wants to kill this guy for some reason. Meanwhile, Lewis is doing everything in his power to protect Fernier, not for himself, but because he is taking care of a bunch of young women and sisters. Of course, Lestat finally gets his way and manages to kill Fernier when he's returning from a duel. Lewis, in a desperate bid to keep the family afloat, approaches the eldest sister, Babette, and starts advising her on a few matters to help her get her footing and maintain the plantation. And Babette is actually pretty important for our story too. This is Lewis's second big link to humanity. He suggests that she is a perfect human. She's smart and capable in a way that's not just beyond other women, but beyond most men as well. Babette's good opinion is really important to Lewis. Lewis sort of hides in the shadows and kind of whispers to her from the outside. He really wants her to respect him, to take his advice seriously, and to succeed and flourish in this world without her brother. Looking at Lestat's father for a moment, little to no consequence in this book, but it is my goal to do these kind of breakdowns with the entire Chronicles of the Vampire series, and anything that we can get about Lestat's dad now is kind of important for us to remember going forward. Some interesting contradictions in Lestat and his relationship with his father. It seems like he hates his dad and wants him to suffer, but at the same time, he loved his father enough to bring him all the way from France here to the Americas. We know there is some kind of altercation between Lestat and his dad when Lestat was a child. As his dad is dying, he's trying very hard to apologize and make some kind of amends for it, and Lestat is not having it. He's so angry at his dad, violent, he can barely stay in the room, and he begs Lewis to kill his father for him. But at the same time, it is notable that Lestat is unable to kill his father himself or physically harm his dad in any way, even though he has this violent urge and tendency. And from this interaction, Lewis does contemplate Lestat as a man versus a vampire. Lestat, the brilliant pupil, a lover of books that had been burned. I knew only Lestat who sneered at my library, called it a pile of dust, ridiculed me relentlessly, my reading, my meditations. Page 62, Interview with a Vampire. And this makes me wonder, does Lewis know Lestat at all? Lestat's mortal father humanizes him to Lewis. For the first time, he wonders who Lestat was, and if Lestat is entirely different in his vampiric form, and if human Lestat and vampire Lestat are so different, is Lewis also much changed? And this brings us to the Slave Rebellion. So Lewis and Lestat have been living with Lestat's dad at Point de Lac, and this whole time Lewis has been trying to kind of hide himself and Lestat from the slaves because there's been kind of whisperings and rumblings that there's something not quite right. A lot of them are going missing and dying, and all of this eventually culminates into a massive slave uprising where they storm Point de Lac and set it on fire in an attempt to kill Lewis and Lestat. So talking a little bit about the characterization of the slaves from Lewis's perspective. Lewis the man is able to give more credence and credit and agency to his slaves than he was as a human. That they have intelligence and a depth of experience as much as, and in some ways, greater to his white compatriots. And I think high school Jess would have seen this and been like, oh, becoming a vampire means that you no longer have racism. That might have even been the intention of this scene originally, but I've come to view it differently. There's still an us versus them mentality. Us the vampires versus them the humans now. He can give people of different races credit and agency and intelligence that they didn't have before. Even here, where he is now free of prejudice, he still seems to value white lives more than he does the black slaves' lives. For example, he refers to his slaves as a mass of people, and when he talks about other white people, he usually discusses individuals specifically. Lestat equally terrorizes both the slaves and the noble people. Lewis tries to stop him from killing Fournier and terrorizing the nobles. He chides Lestat for killing the slaves, but he never really tries to stop him. Lewis calls out the fact that the slaves are closer to him and Lestat, that they have opportunity to see more, that they're significantly more suspicious of the two of them than any white people he meets, he never suspects until it's too late that the slaves are actually more dangerous to him than the white people are. And all of this sort of indicates that Lewis is still dealing with a certain level of prejudice and presumption of one color of people against another color of people. And in some ways it's more insidious now because he's claiming that he can see and value these people equally, and he's not. And all of this is like a much longer and more interesting discussion I'm trying to set up for when I discuss Interview with a Vampire, the TV show, because this little bit we get right here touches on how race was covered within the canon of the series, and I'd like to see what the adaptation does with it when they make Lewis a black man. So as the slaves are rebelling, Lestat and Lewis have to flee Point de Loc, and they have nowhere to go. In desperation, Lewis leads the two of them to Babette's home, and he begs her for safety from the oncoming dawn. Babette reluctantly takes them in, mostly based off of the good counsel Lewis has given her in the past. While they're stuck underground waiting the day out, Babette is learning about Point de Loc's destruction and learning a little bit more about Lewis and Lestat's misdeeds throughout the last few years. When she comes to let Lewis and Lestat out the following night, she confronts them. She calls Lewis evil and attempts to murder both of them. Her life was rich and good. I knew she mustn't do this. Like all strong people, she suffered always a measure of loneliness. She was a marginal outsider, a secret infidel of certain sort, and the balance by which she lived might be upset if she were to question her own goodness. I'd fallen back, helpless against the pillar, helpless as much from the fire and the blow as the knowledge that Babette meant to destroy me. As much from the knowledge that I did not know what I was. Lewis on page 69. This confrontation with Babette shakes Lewis up a lot. Her calling him evil and of the devil makes Lewis wonder if he is evil and where he and vampires as a whole came from. This is a whole philosophical conversation that apparently Lewis never thought of before now. And this obsession with Babette naturally leads David to interject and ask whether or not Lewis loves her. Lewis denies, but it is an interesting point to consider because perhaps some of the animosity between Lestat and Babette can best be explained by Lewis's attention and care and interest in this rando woman, while Lestat is out here making Lewis immortal, taking care of him and seeing that he lives forever. Babette, the one he's showering all his attention and care on, is attempting to destroy him. In this moment when Babette is trying to kill Lewis and Lestat is striking back, Lewis is stepping in between the two of them to protect Babette. He does not give a crap about Lestat. Since Lewis has become a vampire, he's pretty much wanted to leave Lestat's company and hasn't been able to do it. Lewis is at a new low, and he thinks he has got to leave Lestat now or he will be destroyed. So Lewis is now safely in New Orleans. Lestat has fed. Lewis has left him and is just kind of like wandering the streets, wondering if he is a bad dude. And while he's doing all of this, his hunger is growing and growing. But instead of focusing on feeding as he needs to, he's just sort of like questioning himself. And it's in this mindset where Lewis meets Claudia, a 5-year-old child who is crying and desperate by her mother's plague corpse. It seems Claudia doesn't understand that her mother is dead. She goes to Lewis and begs him for help. Lewis is hypnotized. Her youth, her innocence. Am I damned? If so, why do I feel such pity for her gaunt face? Why do I wish to touch her tiny, soft arms, hold her now on my knee as I am doing? Feel her bend her head to my chest as I gently touch her satin hair. If I am damned, I must want to kill her. I must want to make her nothing but food for a cursed existence, because being damned, I must hate her. Interview with a Vampire, page 73. In that moment, Lewis decides he is damned, he does hate Claudia, and he needs to destroy her by feeding on her now. But he's also having this telltale heart moment of immense guilt, feeling her heart beating, fighting for life, and it triggers his guilt, and he unlatches from her and kind of hurls her away. In a state of denial and extreme upset, Louis turns to flee this whole scene and pretend it didn't happen, and when he looks, there's Lestat. Louis describes Lestat's reaction to him feeding off Claudia as very taunting and mean. From my perspective, I kind of read it more like Lestat celebrating Louis finally coming into the fold and becoming a vampire and embracing his nature and truth. Lestat has complained repeatedly that Louis is not like him. Feeding off of Claudia like this actually proves that Lestat and Louis are as much alike as Lestat wants them to be. And when Lestat sees Louis's reactions in earnest, he sort of like changes his tone and mood a little bit and starts to come in almost like sort of comforting or calming. Are you afraid? The child's alive, Louis. You left her breathing. Shall I go back and make her a vampire? We could use her, Louis. Wait, Louis! I'll go back for her if you say. Page 74, Interview with a Vampire. Louis fights Lestat as he never has and basically runs away from this entire scene, just trying to forget it. And as always, Louis loses steam, a sense of convictions, and just stops and lets Lestat win. But Lestat is sort of unusual tonight, and he says that the two will sleep on it and have a real conversation tomorrow. The next evening, Louis gets up and confronts Lestat. He asks why Lestat became a vampire, why Lestat is so cruel to him, and last but perhaps most importantly, why did Lestat turn him? Lestat is both silent and snide during this little tirade of Louis's. And because of this, Louis threatens to leave and find answers elsewhere. And that's when Lestat decides to drop an unexpected insight into Louis. You chase after phantoms of your former self. Fernier, his sister, these images for you of what you were and what you still long to be. And your romance with a mortal life. You're dead to your vampire nature. You are like an adult who, looking back on his childhood, realizes he never appreciated it. You no longer look through the glass darkly, but you cannot pass back to the world of a human warmth with your new eyes. Page 81, Interview with a Vampire. From this, we see that Lestat is actually pretty insightful because he does point out some interesting things about Louis's motivations on who he protects and who he doesn't, why he might have cared about Fernier and Babette, and perhaps even why he cares about Claudia now. As we gave Louis credit for his insights into Lestat based off of his skills, we may have to give the same benefit to Lestat as he points out these elements within Louis. Of all the things I took away from it, this scene to me pointed out most that neither vampire knew the other very well. They could get small glimpses based off of their kills and actions, but they weren't seeing the whole of it. Louis and Lestat have very different priorities. Louis wishes to reduce the suffering of sentient beings, and Lestat is more concerned with his own pleasure. Louis confronts Lestat about his wasteful and murderous ways. If I can live from the blood of animals, why should I not live from the blood of animals rather than go through the world bringing misery and death among human creatures? And Lestat responds, does this give you happiness? This is insanity, Louis. For I guarantee that if you walk the streets tonight and strike down a woman as rich and beautiful as Babette and suck her blood until she drops to your feet, you will be filled with all of her life you can hold. With the same sensibility that you cherish, you will see death in all its beauty. Life as it is, only known all the more on the point of death. Page 82. So more on this vampire nature. It seems both Louis and Lestat yearn for the beauty of life. Louis views Lestat's actions as the destruction of that. Lestat sees his own kills as taking the beauty into himself and keeping it forever. Lestat posits that death is a vampire's nature, part of the divine plan. The juxtaposition between Louis's longing for that life and Lestat's taking of that life seems to imply true vampire nature is as a vessel that strains between being empty and full. There's only the longing for what they don't have and the taking until they're sated and full for a moment. And one more lore drop. Lestat warns Louis away from seeking other vampires. They'll see you coming long before you see them, and they'll see your flaw, and, distrusting you, they'll seek to kill you. They'd seek to kill you even if you were like me, because they are lone predators and seek for companionship no more than cats in the jungle. They're jealous of their secrets and of their territory, and if you find one or more of them together, it will be for safety only, and one will be the slave of the other, the way you are with me. There's no way to know if Lestat's words are meant as an intimidation or if they're the truth, but we should ask, are other vampires, as Lestat claims? Would they shun Lewis for his nature? Would they shun Lestat for his? Do they seek others of their kind, or do they see them as a threat? Is the loneliness present in Lewis and Lestat unique to them and not found in others of their kind? This conversation brings Lewis into a trance very similar to the one he fell under when he first met Lestat. Lestat urges him to come with him. Where they go, find Claudia still alive in an orphanage and adopt her. Lestat urges Lewis to drink from her again. When he's brought her to the point of near death, Lestat stops Lewis, offers his wrist to Claudia, and she feeds greedily from him. So strongly, Lestat struggles to get away from her teeth. David interrupts here to say he'd done this to the little girl just to keep you with him. Lewis speculates there are multiple reasons for Claudia's turning. Lestat does want to keep Lewis and the money with him. Lestat sees Claudia as an experiment to see what the vampire nature truly is. And third, Lestat kills Claudia out of revenge. He had been truly vulnerable with Lewis in that conversation. The only way for him to get back on top is a show of strength. Turning Claudia works. For the next 65-ish years, there is domestic bliss in this vampire household. Lewis loves and cherishes Claudia, and Lestat seems to enjoy her company as well. But even as Lewis is comforted by Claudia, her presence also makes him aware of how vulnerable he and she are to Lestat, and it makes him hesitate from rebelling. Lewis is there to provide love, companionship, reading, philosophy, art, and Lestat is there teaching Claudia everything there is about being a vampire and killing viciously and cunningly. Claudia seems to enjoy both of their presences and lessons equally. The only thing in those early years that concern Lewis at all is that for several of them, Claudia remains mute. Claudia and Lestat might hunt and seduce, stay long in the company of the doomed victim, enjoying the splendid humor of his unwitting friendship with death. But I still could not bear it. Page 97, Interview with a Vampire. And Lewis himself is an evolved predator. He starts killing humans. In New Orleans, he finds the people there a faceless mass, a sea parting before him. He has no personal connection to anyone, and he no longer loves humanity as he once loved Babette. What has changed Lewis's feeding habits? Is it the companionship with Claudia? Is it to protect Claudia from Lestat because he knows Lestat would like this? Is it just simply that Lewis is like so many other people and is able to do terrible things to an anonymous person, but not to someone he's personally connected to? Claudia's mind continues to evolve and mature as her body never will. She stops playing with the younger childish toys and picks up more adult sophisticated things. Her outfits become more elaborate, and she has plans and insights that would never come to a child's mind. And as these changes happen, Claudia starts to become more reserved. Eventually, she even demands her own child's coffin so that she can sleep separately from Lewis, which devastates him. And when Claudia sees how incredibly upset Lewis is by this, she says to him, "I don't want it if it hurts you. I'll stay with you always, but I must see it. Don't you understand? A coffin for a child." Claudia's trying to come to terms with the fact that she is in a child's body while her two mentors and companions are in an adult's body. She needs to know what that means and come to some kind of understanding. Instead of this coffin helping her, though, Claudia's erratic behavior continues to escalate. One night she kills all the household servants and just leaves them in the townhouse. When Lestat and Lewis find them, Lestat flies into a rage and demands Lewis clean it up. Claudia returns home. Lestat starts laying into her about killing at the house and leaving it there, and Claudia just interrupts him and demands to know how she was made, which shocks Lestat into silence and just seems to further drive Claudia into prodding at him and poking him. While we could read Lestat's refusal to explain how Claudia came into being as just another extension of him withholding vampire secrets from Lewis and now Claudia as well, we might also see it as a kindness to Louis, because we know that Louis played a part in Claudia's turning. Also know that Louis has some kind of guilt towards that, and that he needs Claudia's love and relationship to survive and be happy. So in some ways, Lestat is protecting both himself as well as Louis. Eventually, Claudia begs Louis to tell what he knows, and Louis succumbs and tells her everything. At first, Claudia does rage at Louis and the part he played in her death. She seems to get over the betrayal, and she says, "I have no human nature, yet I have your tongue, your passion for the truth. Your need to drive the needle of the mind right to the heart of it all. Like the beak of the hummingbird who beats so wild and fast that mortals might think he has no tiny feet, could never set, just go from quest to quest, going again and again for the heart of it. I am your vampire self more than you are, and now the sleep of 65 years has ended." He made me then, to be your companion. No chains could have held you in your loneliness, and he could give nothing. He gives me nothing. I used to think him charming. I liked the way he walked, the way he tapped the flagstones with his walking stick and swung me in his arms, and the abandon with which he killed, which was as I felt. But I no longer find him charming, and you never have. Page 116 to 117, Interview with a Vampire. And let's take a minute and ask here, why does Claudia need to know how she was made? Claudia's never really had an opportunity to see herself as human the way both Louis and Lestat have. So we do have to wonder what this child to adult equation is in her. Why she thinks her body doesn't match her attitude and who she is. Claudia devises a plan for Louis and her to leave Lestat. Louis doesn't believe that Lestat will let the two of them go, and Claudia tells him she plans to kill Lestat. Louis protests. Claudia argues a bit with him, refuses to go into details, and insists that Louis just let her handle it. And meanwhile, Louis makes arrangements for the two of them to leave New Orleans. Notably, within Louis's plans, he does include funds to leave Lestat. Here we get a David interruption where he asks if Claudia was destroyed in her attempt to kill Lestat. And Louis doesn't really answer this question. He just says, "Don't you think she could do it?" Put a pin in that. Back to Lestat. He's made friends with this musician. Louis doesn't think anything about it at first because Lestat likes to play with his victims and often befriends them, but he's been hanging out with this musician and funding him for a long time. And Louis is kind of beginning to wonder if he's fond of him or not. One night, Lestat comes back from visiting his musician buddy and is in like a grand mood, asks Louis if he remembers the Frenier household and realizes that there are now rumors it's been haunted. And this is our opportunity to catch up with Babette. Babette had died young, insane, restrained finally from wandering towards the ruins of Point de Lac, insisting she had seen the devil and she must find him. I thought occasionally of going to her, of trying some way to rectify what I had done. The other times, I thought it would all heal itself. And this little mini update does have us wondering, why does Louis care about Babette if he's truly divorced from humanity, as he says he is? And what does Babette's death mean to Louis? And what does the Frenier place and its haunting mean to Lestat? Here he is in a jovial mood, enjoying his new friendship and his new time with the musician, and now he's needling Louis for some reason. So Claudia interrupts this squabble before it can truly take off, and she and Lestat argue for a little bit, but Claudia insists she's here to apologize and make amends. While Lestat is skeptical, Claudia has some great wisdom to drop on us. Hell is hatred, people living together in eternal hatred. We're not in hell. You can take the present or not, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Only, let's have an end to all this. So Claudia offers Lestat 2 young boys she found in the orphanage for him to feed on. They're sleeping peacefully in a bed surrounded by wine and food that they had their fill of beforehand. Lestat is enthralled by the 2 children, seems to immediately accept the apology, even offers Claudia one of the children to feed on. Mutual, all is forgiven. But something was wrong. Lestat was staring at the ceiling. He lay too still. He appeared to shiver, his shoulders convulsing. A veil had fallen over his clear gray eyes. Page 134, Interview with a Vampire. Turns out Claudia poisoned the blood of both boys and plans to kill Lestat this way. She warns Louis to stay back, pulls out her knife, and starts stabbing Lestat over and over again. And every time Louis tries to intervene, she tells him to stay back, she's got this. And eventually, with all the blood pooling everywhere, Lestat just stops struggling. His form withers, and Claudia, coated in this gorn viscera, stares and tells Louis to look too. Horrified and in a state of immense emotional distress, the thing lay still. A great mass of wavy blonde hair, a coat, a pair of gleaming boots, and thus horror that had been Lestat, and I staring helplessly at it. Moving into the aftermath of this attack. For a long time, Claudia merely stood there. Blood had soaked the carpet, darkening the woven wreaths of flowers. It gleamed sticky and black on the floorboards. It stained her dress, her white shoes, her cheek. She wiped it with a crumpled napkin and took a swipe at the impossible stains of the dress. Claudia has to prod Louis and get him to help her lift all the boys and Lestat into the carriage to dispose of the bodies. They drive out to a swamp. Louis gets rid of the young boys first. He carries a white sheet wrapped Lestat out further and deeper than he went with either of the boys, and he stands there staring at the corpse of Lestat in the water for a long time. This is Lestat. This is all of transformation and mystery, dead, gone into the eternal darkness. I felt a pull suddenly, as some forever were struggling for me to go down with him, to descend into the dark water and never come back. It spoke without language, saying, "You know what you must do. Come down into the darkness. Let it all go away." He hated living with Lestat. He thought the guy was a douche canoe. He took every opportunity in this monologue so far to belittle Lestat, and Louis did not think that Lestat would ever let him or Claudia leave, so he felt the three of them just had to chill out and be miserable together forever. Now that Lestat is dead, Louis is gutted at his loss, incredibly betrayed that Claudia did what she said she was going to do and what was the only way for the two of them to get away from him. What explains Louis's feelings and reactions here? The next evening, Claudia is up early and she's throwing Lestat's belongings around, looking for something, anything that would indicate where they could start looking for other vampires. And she's really upset and frustrated because he left nothing behind. She turns to Louis looking for comfort, and Louis is just stone cold to her. Doesn't want her to stay in his coffin anymore. Basically just wants her to get out and never to have to deal with her again. And that causes a complete transformation and breakdown in Claudia. "I would die rather than live without you. I would die the same way he died. I can't bear for you to look at me the way you did. I cannot bear it if you do not love me." Her sobs grew worse, more bitter, until finally I bent and kissed her soft neck and cheeks. Winter plums. Plums from an enchanted wood where the fruit would never fall from the boughs, where the flowers would never wither and die. "All right, my dear," I said to her, and I rocked her slowly, gently, in my arms, until she dozed, murmuring something about our being eternally happy, free of Lestat forever, beginning the great adventure of our lives. And this leads us to, what is Claudia feeling? Does she truly love and feel an emotional bond between the two of them? Does she need his love and approval to continue to live? Is she truly willing to lay down and die if Louis turns away from her? And what is Louis feeling in this moment? This crying seems to snap him out of it. And this angst fest is just beginning because Lestat's death has triggered Louis to think about his brother's death. And he passes by this church and goes in there to be all maudlin or whatever. He has like this intense hallucination or imagining about the church and God and holiness. Basically, he decides that like the church doesn't have God in it and the only thing that's immortal in there is him. him. In this moment where he's in this church, a priest approaches him, asks if he wants or needs confession. Louis agrees to do confession, and then he goes in there and impulsively tells him all about him being a vampire and a crazy murderer. The priest does not react well. Louis reacts badly to how the priest is reacting, reveals himself in the light. The priest is in terror and trying to backpedal and calling for God to save him. Louis sinks his teeth into the priest and kills him. It's a very interesting little part of the story because it means that Louis is at the same point that Lestat was at when he tried to kill Babette. A couple days later, Lestat's musician friend actually comes to their townhouse looking for Lestat, which Louis thinks is pretty unusual and odd. He tries to make the musician go away by giving him money, telling him that Lestat wanted him to be well and healthy, and the musician is not really buying it. His eyes seem glazed over. He seems very insistent that Lestat wouldn't leave without him, that there should be a personal letter of some kind if this is the case, but eventually Louis kind of just like shoves him out with the money and kind of like shoulder shrugs and is like, nothing to see here. It's kind of an interesting scene because it sort of starts establishing the cult of Lestat, that Lestat has like this magnetism about him that goes beyond being charming or charismatic or even beautiful. Sometimes Louis seems to fall under this spell, like when he was turned. There's something just about Lestat that drives people to want to be near him and devoted to him. But Claudia and Louis are off returning to normal. They're packing up the house. They're making plans to go overseas and look for vampires so Claudia can finally be with her own kind. The way she says that makes Louis realize that he is not part of her own kind. All this time that Louis thought Claudia was out there sating her needs the same way that Lestat did, it was like something else for her. She's still looking for some sort of kindred spirit. And David interrupts, asking why Louis didn't teach her Claudia humanity the same way that he taught her so many other things. To what avail? Asked the vampire simply. So she might suffer as I did? Oh, I'll grant you, I should have taught her something to prevail against her desire to kill Lestat. For my own sake, I should have taught her that. But you see, I had no confidence in anything else. Once fallen from grace, I had confidence in nothing. On the night Louis and Claudia are meant to leave New Orleans forever and begin their grand vampire journey, Claudia runs back to the townhouse in a panic, insisting something is following her. Louis looks out the window, and at first he thinks it's nothing, but then he sees the musician, now turned vampire, definitely following and stalking Claudia. And as Louis is trying to process this and figure out what's going on, he hears a very familiar but what he thought was impossible footstep on the townhouse step. That's right, Lestat's alive, he's turned a musician, and he is here to get revenge on Louis and Claudia. A fight ensues between the four vampires, and Louis and Claudia end up getting the upper hand by setting the townhouse and the vampires on fire. In all of the commotion while everything is burning, they rush out of the townhouse, they escape the mob, and they get onto the boat to sail away to their adventure. Louis stays awake the whole night, waiting for Lestat to come after them, and when they set up anchor and sail away, that's when he's decided they are finally free. But Louis is certain the first attack didn't kill Lestat, that he somehow got out of the second one just fine too. And that's going to be the end of our part 1 recap of Interview with a Vampire. I hope you're enjoying it so far. I did my best to pick out some good quotes, some good dramatic moments, and also to pick a couple themes here and there that might be interesting to viewers, but might also not be the normal fare that you get in a standard discussion. If you guys are enjoying this so far, let me know in those comments down below. If nothing else, leave me a vampire emoji to let me know you got this far in the video. I'm gonna see you next time for part 2, hopefully. And until then, keep reading. Bye!